at home, on my computer, I have a desktop. And on that desktop, I have files that I can't hold, but they go into a folder that I can't hold. And when they've outlived their usefulness, I can put them in the trash can. And then I can take that trash can and I can empty it into oblivion. And then I can open a window that lets in no sun, and I can surf without water on a web that has no spiders, and I can enter a chat room that has no door. But then I can walk in and I can post my ideas on a message board that is mounted to nothing, all from the comfort of my own desk, all at the touch of a mouse. Now, I don't know about you, but this excessive stacking of visual metaphors gets to be a bit much, and frankly, kind of comical at times. So the visuals that we have, that we're always interacting with, we use these as crutches. See, language, it's a tool. I mean, it's a useful tool, but it's also a very deceptive tool. We use this language to deceive our senses every day into believing that we are touching things and experiencing things that we really aren't, and that we are visiting spaces that we can never actually inhabit. We use this language to actually bring forth a tactile memory of an experience, that we are touching things that don't actually exist in spaces that we will never actually be able to visit. No, fortunately, I'm an artist. So these things, the idea of kind of making something out of nothing, well, it's kind of what I do. So before I get into the what, why, and how of my art, I need to explain a little quirk about my cognitive process. I have synesthesia. Now, synesthesia, for those of you who don't actually have much experience with synesthesia, it's what happens when the brain cross-references two different ideas, two different senses, or two different cognitive pathways. Now, there are many different possible combinations of these. For instance, as you see up in the slide above, some people actually look at letters and see color. Some people actually equate personalities with individual numbers. So you'll find maybe a lazy number 7 and a sly number 9. Some people can take actual scents and turn them into shapes. So, for instance, you could actually have, say, that turkey over there. It's a little pointy. You might want to add some sage just to kind of round out the flavor. There are also people who can take music and convert it to pictures. I mean, how awesome would that be? Just every time you turn on the radio, you've got this little visualization in front of you. That would be awesome. Now, personally, for myself, I have a couple different types of synesthesia, and they manifest at different times and different degrees. But personally, the two that are most relevant at this point in time, that are most relevant to how language helps us define space, I have spatial sequence synesthesia, and I have time-space synesthesia. Now, both of these relate to space, and essentially what this means is that units of time and strings of data, they evolve naturally into patterns in my mind. Those patterns actually bear a direct physical spatial relationship to my body. Now, I realize that this is kind of an obscure, odd thing to try to grasp, so I have come up with a little visualization exercise, so I know we always love those, to kind of help you put things in perspective. Yay. Everybody close your eyes. Trust me. Picture yourself in New York City. Now, you can use whatever sensory memories you have for this to fill in the blanks. What time of day is it? What's the weather like? What does the ground feel like under your feet? What do you hear? What do you smell? Now hold that into your mind and open your eyes. Now I'd like you all to point to New York City. Here's a hint, that's North Street, south to north. If you have no sense of direction, just point where everybody else is pointing, that's fine. No, perfect. You have a clear sense and a picture of a feel for what New York City is like in your head, even though it's over there. That's fine. Some of you may have even had like an actual physical sensory reaction to some of the thoughts you came up with. A couple of you took a deep breath or laughed when I said smell. That's fine. What's important here is to realize how valuable the sensory language is that they're giving us when you're trying to deal with talking about virtual spaces. Next. Close your eyes. You're in June. What does it feel like? What does it sound like? What does the ground feel like under your feet? Now open your eyes. Today is March 22nd. Point to June. 1. Right, for me, it's right here. June, July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March. I can walk through the months of the year just like I'm walking around the block. I can stand outside it. I know what it feels like under my feet, because this is my visual of time. Now, this may be a little awkward as well for some people to try to figure out, but it's the parallels between this internal space that I walk through every day and that virtual space, the theoretical space that I get to interact with on a daily basis. Now, for this whole problem, the parallels between these are what I make my art out of. This is where this comes from, but I blame language. I know I like to place blame, but language is an interesting trick here. New technology is kind of hard to deal with and adapt to. So manufacturers and marketers have come up with these appealing metaphors to kind of help us along. So we have familiar visuals and familiar language that they use to package new ideas. It's like a conduit towards understanding and comprehension and assimilation. Now, sometimes those two visuals may clash. We call that bad advertising. But the interesting point here is that we have the capacity to hold two completely different sensory experiences together for one word, like mouse and mouse. Two different things, but we can still hold on to them. There is one word for me, home, that is actually the hardest one for me to try to find a personal visual for. I mean, the language itself says a concrete space, someplace I can inhabit. It's an idea, it's mine, it's cozy, but I know there's nothing there. And I don't know if any of you have ever thought about this or tried to visualize your virtual home, but I think in almost entirely pictures. So yes, this has come up. And I just had to flip through two of them. But when I first sat down to think about this, I didn't get very far with visuals. I have the wonderful 1970s living room scene with the potted plants and the Afghan knitted by grandma or aunt somebody. Or the other extreme, the 1980s album cover. Random digitally designed some sort of landscape. Neither one of these felt particularly comfortable to me. Neither one of them felt like it was mine or real. And another perspective is it's like me asking you to visualize New York City even though you've never left the farm. You have no visuals, you have no sensory memory, you have nothing with which to build a mental picture. But, there's a certain freedom as an artist in knowing that the entire thing is an illusion. In some sort of desperate attempt to get a feel for my virtual space, I decided that I would actually build a physical model of my virtual space. No problem. I needed a few things to think about. First, space, architecture, and materials. So, space. What kind of space am I building? Is it the William Gibson cyberspace where you can jack into a world that's information and digital, kind of let your consciousness roam? Or is it the Neil Stephenson's metaverse where you upload yourself and it's like the next step of social interaction? Virtual people, virtual world, whole new social order. Or the Matrix. A lot of you guys know what I'm talking about here. The Matrix, where it's actually just an elaborate, beautiful cage, where somewhere the personal, physical, and the virtual kind of interact and overlap and change on a regular basis. What I quickly realized is that no matter what I needed to build, I wanted something familiar to me. I wanted something that was actually more like my space that I walk through than anything else. Here's a question though. What kind of construction can you actually make in a virtual space? What is possible? Truth is, anything. And that's kind of the problem. So the physics of this world and the physics of the virtual world are completely different. So in a virtual world, you have no rain, so you don't need a roof. There's no sun, so you don't need windows. There's no floor, there's no gravity, so you don't need a floor. And essentially, I had just eliminated all the factors that you would normally take into consideration when building a physical home. So I wandered on to materials as my next step. What I had to find was something that would reinforce my intent without just being distracting. It had to be tangible, but kind of hint at intangibility for something I couldn't touch in the virtual world. After going around and wandering through stores and touching all sorts of material, trying not to get in trouble. I settled on this material, and I chose it because of its foggy nature. It's got that kind of vague look to it already. It's extremely lightweight, easy to work with, but the interesting thing is how it feels. It feels right. It actually feels like silky, smooth, soft skin. And I kind of like the idea that my internal architecture feels almost human. So I took this material and I fold it into these vague architectural shapes, as if somehow somebody started constructing and midway said, no, that's good enough. That's all we need. Now, these pieces, I wanted to get a little bit more about some illusion, back to M.C. Escher and the fact we have a virtual world. So I took these images and I put the objects on a mirrored base. The benefit of this is the top part is a physical, and the bottom mirrored base was actually intangible. I couldn't touch it. This is what it looks like when you walk around it. Now, being that I'm a photographer, I was very distracted by my shiny construction, so I took a lot of pictures, a lot. Right here, in a normal image, a straight, flat image, I tried to show something about distance between two objects in the virtual world, but it's a two-dimensional space, so I ended up with size. I've got that big one in the bottom corner and a tiny one in the top. I didn't quite have what I wanted. What I wanted in an image is something that would also convey something about the virtual world, the possibility of existing in multiple places at once, like New York City here, New York City over there somewhere, and also New York City in the palm of my hand. I needed to fold the space. I needed to fold the time. I needed to find a way to do this, and I needed inspiration. So, Robert Heinlein, he made this great story. It's called And He Built a Crooked House, where a man, an architect, decides to build this fourth dimensional space folded out into a three-dimensional form. He lives in it, but he built it on the San Andreas Fault. One earthquake and the entire thing folds in on itself. You have a perfect fourth dimensional cube, and that man spends the rest of the story trying to escape his own house, the maze of a fourth dimension. Georges Louis Bourges, he has an entire universe he wrote about that's this honeycomb library. And of course, M.C. Escher, the illusions have fascinated me ever since I was a little kid. I have many reasons that these interest me in the folding of space and warping of time, but I could go on, but I have a pretty picture of a tesseract for you. This is a tesseract. This is what that fourth dimensional cube looks like as it folds and unfolds in a third dimensional space. And it's very distracting. So I went back into Photoshop because that's my tool that I'm comfortable with. And I went to fold my space. What I ended up doing, since I wanted to minimally edit these images, I still wanted the same tactile feel. I took the image, I doubled it, I shifted it, and I overlapped them just a little opacity change, and they blended together. And I finally did it. In one image, I had folded space, I had folded time for myself. I have both a tactile feel of it. I know what that feels like. I know exactly what it sounds like when I touch it. I know what it smells like. I had it. So I kept building. The interesting thing about these spaces, when I put these up in a show and I put a photograph on the wall, the interactions that I have with the different people looking at them are all about space. Well, not all. Most of them will tell me, oh, this feels like I'm in a garden, or this looks like I'm in a castle, or I like this room, I like this space. Some people, they start to actually see faces or animals in the shapes. And to me, that's interesting, the fact that I have human shapes or animal shapes and architecture possessed in the same image. Now, that was just fascinating for me to hear. The best reaction that I've ever gotten, I have one woman who purchased one of my prints simply because she loves the sound of it. She physically converts shape into sound, and she hears music every time she sees my prints. So she mounted it in her living room, so her living room always has a pretty soundtrack. I wish I had that. So whereas my personal synesthesia is kind of accidental and involuntary, and sometimes incredibly distracting, most of you, the majority of you, when you come in contact with the virtual world, you do what you have to do. You rely on familiar narratives, familiar pictures, so that somehow, somewhere along the lines, it becomes at least mentally tangible. Now, my advice, my personal advice, is that when you guys go home tonight, touch the walls. Look at every corner. Get a feel for that space. Listen. Breathe it in. And feel the floor under your feet. And if you have to interact with a virtual world, well, accept the illusion. Challenge that language and rebuild. Rebuild everything. Thank you.